Secretary of Defense James Mattis is breaking his silence and sharing some of his thoughts on the Trump administration. In an interview with The Atlantic, he says he had no choice but to leave the administration because he just couldn't connect the dots anymore. Privately, according to friends and aides who spoke to The Atlantic, it went much deeper than that. They say Mattis found the president to be of limited cognitive ability and of generally dubious character. We're going to put those two thoughts together, lacking in cognitive ability and a character problem. Wow. Mattis's public criticism comes on the heels of a particularly frenetic two-week period with President Trump, who referred to himself as the chosen one, and canceled a trip to Denmark because that country refused to sell him Greenland, an island that was not for sale. The former defense secretary joins a number of former administration officials, call them the adults in the room, who as private citizens have been critical of the president's governing skills. Take a look.
I think part of it was obviously we are starkly different in our styles. We did not have a common value system. When the president would say, well, here's what I want to do, and here's how I want to do it. And I'd have to say to him, well, Mr. President, I understand what you want to do, but you can't do it that way. It violates the law. It violates a treaty. You know, he got really frustrated.
When the process breaks down, then you're sort of, in my mind, living in chaos. I don't want to live in a chaotic organization.
Well, General Mattis resigned in protest, of course, back in December of 2018 after President Trump announced the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops in Syria, a move he would later rescind. Well, according to the Atlantic interview, Mattis objected, telling the president, you're going to have to get the next Secretary of Defense to lose to ISIS. I'm not going to do it. For more, I'm joined by Charlie Sykes, editor-in-chief of The Bulwark, Heather McGhee, distinguished senior fellow at Demos, and Heidi Presla, NBC News correspondent. I want to start with Heidi on this, and my question is, it does seem that the adults leave, and they leave behind circumspect but recognizable problems. They do say things like, well, cognitive ability is what you talk about in a person being studied for dementia. It's a serious problem. Okay. Do you recognize reality? What day is it, sir? That sort of thing.
Okay, but those things are the things that are being said off the record or on background,
or
not attributable directly to them. They are not coming out to the American people and hitting them over the head. We have not seen that. And so the question now, even with Mattis, and even with in his book, the furthest he goes is really not that far. He just suggests that he could no longer take it. He doesn't speak in detail about it. So the question is whether all of these officials who were supposed to be adults, who are all now gone, like McMaster, like Tillerson, John Kelly, are going to hold hands together and come out and give us more specifics of what they've witnessed specifically about his cognitive abilities or specifically about really scary situations that they may have witnessed with the president in his judgment.
Heather, it seems like what's helping Trump here, perhaps unfairly, is the old boy system in the sense that you have to show some respect for a previous office. Your transactional relationship, your relationship with once you've served in high office, you can't just go out the door and act like you're some sort of saboteur.
That's right. And I mean, if you think about the Obama administration, right, 8 years, hundreds of people who came in and out, and there has not been some salacious tell-all. You've not.
Maybe there wasn't any salacious reality.
Right, exactly. But that's important, right? You need that kind of loyalty. The problem is Donald Trump has broken all of the norms. We don't need to recite them all here. And yet you've still got this sort of code of gentlemen. I mean, General Mattis, his book is not actually about his time in the White House.
Even Kirsten Nielsen.
His book is about
Kirsten Nielsen. Some of the other cabinet people have women who just, it's not all boys here.
Yeah, that's right.
She has this, even though she was pushed out.
Right. But the problem is, this is a country over code question, right? Because all of these norms are supposed to protect the republic. And the question is, are they going to sit by and not raise their hands before the critical vote next November?
Thank you.
And that's really the question.
Same question for both of you. Anyway, former Secretary Mattis, who was pushed by the reporter from The Atlantic for his personal thoughts, which is, by the way, what we do, is push people, as Heather was suggesting we ought to do, refused to answer. Listen to this. He told reporter Jeffrey Goldberg, you don't endanger the country by attacking the elected commander-in-chief. I may not like a commander-in-chief one freaking bit, but our system puts the commander-in-chief there And to further weaken him when we're up against real threats, I mean, we could be at war on the Korean Peninsula every time they start launching something. However, he warned, there is a period in which I owe my silence. It's not eternal. It's not going to be forever. Now, there's a gentleman. Charlie, get in on this because I'll go back to my thought. Genteel behavior. Honest. You know, I work for presidents and politicians. I represent. If they did something a little bit embarrassing, I wouldn't tell anybody. If they committed a crime, I might have to. But there is a loyalty question about somebody who makes you Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, and James Mattis is not Anthony Scaramucci or Omarosa, right? I mean, he has this code of honor, duty, country. And, you know, the previous guests were absolutely right, though. I mean, at some point, he's got to make the choice whether or not his loyalty to the commander-in-chief and to that military code overrides his loyalty and his obligation to the country to say these things. So if, in fact, he believes that the president of the United States lacks the judgment, lacks the intelligence, lacks the integrity to make sound decisions and to perform his duties, then at some point he has an obligation to share that with the country. And Jeffrey Goldberg is pressing him on that and makes it very clear that he was frustrated that he couldn't get an answer. But he's pressing him, saying, if you do not believe that Donald Trump is fit to be president, you need to share that with the American people before November of 2020.
But who was the tragic hero of Julius Caesar? It was Brutus. Brutus was the great man. He was the one that brought down Caesar, who had become a tyrant. And yet who looked good? He didn't look so good. That's the problem. Let me go back to something that you've raised. If there is a duty to warn us of cognitive problems, character problems, which maybe we as citizens can't see it as journalists, hasn't that been raised, the curtain on that, in the last 2 weeks? By the baffling cartoon behavior of this president?
It does seem to be escalating.
With nobody around him to be adult care providers.
It does seem to be escalating, and yet that job is being put on people like you and I, who are making the same observations that any American who is watching this play out can make. But we are not on the inner circle. And you know, when this is happening publicly, there's so much more to the story that's also happening behind the scenes. And at some point, I think, you know, instead of a single Brutus, what has to happen here is there has to be a daisy chain, or there has to be a decision to hold hands and do this together, because this administration and Trump has also shown that he's capable of destroying any one person. You've seen people who've come out, and now Comey is viewed, for instance, as a sacrificial lamb by a lot of Republicans.
Heather, I will now say something that will probably bother people, but I think it's true. We have a president who, and I'm not a Trump hater. Personally, I'm not a Trump hater. It doesn't work with me, that hating thing. But I see a president running the country, the greatest country in history maybe, with crayons. I want Greenland in crayons. It's like a kid with an 8-year-old with crayons. I want to make more money down in Doral. I like this guy, Boris Johnson, who just suspended the parliament, the mother of all parliaments, just got rid of the parliament. It's Magna Carta's at stake here. And he says, I like this guy's style. This is an 8-year-old.
It's an 8-year-old.
If Mussolini was around today, he'd say, I love that guy's chin, the way it sticks out.
That's right. And he's casting his cabinet and his staff from television. That is the best way to think of it. The worst way to think of it, which is what I do, is I think about the actual 8-year-olds that he is putting through hell with his policies at the border, with his domestic policies around health care and immigration.
Oh, yeah, real kids at the border.
They're real kids, right? They're real kids. And then there's an 8-year-old, as you're saying, sort of in the White House, absolutely saying, I want everything when I want it, when there are actual families and children that are being hurt by his policies.
This guy's Idi Amin. You know, when they found Idi Amin, the guy running Uganda, they found he had toys in his room. He was actually spending his time playing with toys.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.